Hello, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here, my first time in Iceland, and I want to start with a confession. You might know that I gave a talk called The Danger of a Single Story, and one of the ways in which I have survived the lockdown period is by consuming a lot of Scandinavian thrillers on Netflix. And after I exhausted the Norwegian and Swedish and Danish ones, I then moved to the Icelandic ones. And so I fell in love with Trapped. And I was kind of disappointed when I got to Reykjavík and it wasn't like Trapped. So this is my confession on my single story of Iceland. And I beg your forgiveness. So I've called this talk The Pursuit of Joy, because in the past few months, having experienced terrible and very painful losses, I've been thinking a lot about what life means and about what life should mean. I remember a European friend of mine, and I will not name the country from which this friend came, once saying with an eye roll and with that mix of resentful admiration that some European intellectuals have for America, how typically American to have the pursuit of happiness as part of a constitution. Who pursues happiness? And I remember thinking, I do. Don't we all? America may be the only country in which the pursuit of happiness is an enshrined constitutional right, but it seems to me that this, in fact, is the central point of being alive as human beings. We want meaning and we want love, but these ultimately are about joy. We are all in pursuit of joy. How we go about obtaining this happiness, and indeed what counts as happiness to us, will differ from person to person, of course. But to be alive, to be human, is perhaps always to be in pursuit of joy. Throughout the course of our lives, many things constitute obstacles to this quest for joy. Accidents of birth, for example. To be born into a deprived part of the world automatically creates more obstacles to your pursuit of joy. Our personality traits, the class we are born into, the race, the religion. For women, the fact that they are women is very often a large obstacle in their human pursuit of joy. And this is how I like to think of sexism now, that which comes in the way of a woman's pursuit of joy. Of course, it's really about the social and political and cultural and economic obstacles that women face because they are women. But I think of it as obstacles to joy because I increasingly think that while we must change laws that diminish women in different parts of the world, changing mindsets is even more important. We should enact formal policies that support women, but changing cultural attitudes is even more important. And one way to go about changing mindsets and cultural attitudes is through storytelling. Why does it matter that we focus on storytelling? The point is what I will call maximum joy, to create the greatest possible opportunities for joy for the greatest possible number of people in the world. And it brings to mind a line I love by the poet Mary Oliver. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? It is storytelling that illuminates the automatic cultural assumptions that we have. And because automatic cultural assumptions are often from culture, and because we human beings made culture, we can then go about the thorny and complicated and necessary process of unmaking culture. I am a fiction writer, a teller of stories. Literature is my one true love. Literature is my religion. It is literature that shapes the lenses with which I look at the world. Human stories sustain me. I read stories for consolation. I read to feel less alone. I read in the pursuit of knowledge, and I read simply to know. And I have come to believe deeply in the power of storytelling, because it is storytelling that enables real human empathy and real human connection. It is storytelling that creates truth and beauty. And what is life without truth and beauty? A barren exercise. By beauty, I mean all of those things that occasion in us human beings feelings of appreciation and pleasure and gratitude. And by truth, I'm not quite sure what I mean by truth, but I can tell you that I make a distinction between fact and truth. And I can tell you that truth has a certain emotional resonance, a certain emotional heft that fact does not. I knew the basic facts of Nigerian history when I first read the great novels of Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart and Arrow of God. But it was those novels that made me realize that while I may very well know the facts, I did not really know the truths. I knew facts like pacification and amalgamation and indirect rule. But the truths were in the human stories. The story of a respected man being flogged publicly by agents of the British colonial government. The story of an Igbo priest, once resplendent in his pride and his stubbornness, now reduced to sitting on a cold prison floor because he had dared to reject an offer from a British district officer. And in images such as these, I learned a great truth which the history books said nothing about: the loss of dignity. The loss of dignity illuminates so much about Nigerian history and about our present, about our social psychology and about our politics. And still on the subject of Chinua Achebe, in his essay titled Traveling White, he tells a story about a German judge. This distinguished judge, a president of the highest constitutional court in Germany, had just accepted an offer to move to Namibia and become a consultant to the Namibian regime. Then a friend of the judge gave him the novel Things Fall Apart. And after he read it, he promptly and dramatically changed his mind. He would no longer move to Namibia because he could not lend his great abilities to an apartheid system that dehumanized Africans. Chinua Achebe concludes the story by wondering why a man so accomplished needed a novel to make him see this. Did he not read the newspapers? But my sense is that the judge knew only the facts of African history. And in reading Achebe's novel, he was able to see the truths. And it was this truth that propelled him to act. Storytelling constantly reminds us that we are not a collection of logical bones and flesh. We are emotional beings. Dignity and love matter as much as bread and water. And so we celebrate France of La Belle Époque, not for the Dreyfus Affair, but for Proust. We do not celebrate Renaissance Italy for its many endless, pointless wars. We celebrate it for Palestrina and Da Vinci. And while we keep Germany's evils of the Second World War always in sight, it is Goethe and Heine that are its redeemers. I don't know if some of you know that I'm considered something of a feminist. I'm not sure why that is, no. I'm often asked what it's like to be a feminist icon, and I find it to be very amusing because I don't even know what that means. But I also like to say that I want to get a hat with rhinestones that says feminist icon. So I was a feminist long before I knew what the word meant. I didn't read feminist books. I simply watched the world, and I listened to stories, and I read stories. I knew that the world did not give to women the same dignity that it gave to men. I was aware of how much the socialization of women was focused on men. Don't wear a miniskirt. or you'll be raped by a man. Learn to cook and clean so that you can keep a man. Don't be too ambitious so you don't intimidate a man. Don't always say what you really think, and learn to pretend so as to protect a man's ego. And on the other hand, I realized how little of the socialization of men was about women. When I was growing up, I don't remember boys being told to do things or not to do things in order to please girls. Mine is a feminism rooted in stories, in a kind of practicality, in a textured observation of the real lives of women and men. For me, it is a belief system, and it is quite a simple one. Men and women are equal, which they are, in human dignity and human worth. It is not that men and women are the same, because it is in fact the very fact of their difference that caused sexism in the first place. It is the differences between men and women that make feminism necessary in the first place. And the differences really are that men in general were physically stronger than women, and that women's bodies did the long-term labor of reproduction, and both created disadvantages for women. And at the beginning of human civilization, a time that prized strength, this of course meant that women couldn't possibly be the powerful group. We no longer live in that time, but we are products of our history. And if we have lived for centuries in a certain way, with certain belief systems, then the dismantling of those belief systems will require time and effort. I consider myself a student of life and a student for life. And so feminism for me is a journey of learning and unlearning, and it is an ongoing journey. A few years ago, I was at an event in Soweto in South Africa, and a woman asked me a question which I consider one of the best questions I've ever been asked publicly. She said to me, you are known now for making feminism fashionable and cool, and you talk a lot about femininity and feminism not being mutually exclusive, and you've opened it up to women who before would not have claimed themselves as feminists, women who like lip gloss and high heels. And then she said, well, what about women like me? What about women like me who, for so long, took feminism as our refuge? Women like me who, and the word she used was, women like me who are ugly and fat. She was not ugly. And she said, what about us? We now feel as though feminism has become about other things rather than us. And her question really made me stop and think. And it made me think about how sometimes in opening new doors, we can also inadvertently be closing other doors. And it made me decide to be very careful about being very clear that the point is about a broad range of possibilities for women. And so I like to use two dear friends of mine in Lagos as examples, my friend Chioma and my friend Yewande, who are both brilliant, thoughtful, lovely feminist women. But Chioma cannot leave her home without a full face of makeup, and Yewande has absolutely no time for makeup. And for me, they both represent what the ideal is. And so this woman's question from South Africa really, I think, for me, became about questioning how we go about the project of inclusivity. That I realized that in some ways that I was guilty of not realizing that it is in fact possible in the name of inclusivity to inadvertently close the door. I used to feel uncomfortable about talking about the differences between men and women. I felt that because these differences were the roots of female oppression, that it was better not to talk about them. It was better to talk about the fact that people are different more than men and women are different, which is true and which I still believe. But I think we can talk about both. And more importantly, I think that if two groups are not equal, the answer is not to pretend that they are and to then treat them as though that they were. The answer is to actually make them equal. We cannot wish away the real effects of a woman's body on her life's choices and on her life's options. We need only to look, for example, at what is happening today in Texas, in the United States, where a woman's right to autonomy of her body is now in serious peril. I also used to worry about talking too much about the real effects of female socialization, because I thought it might come across as blaming the victim. But we cannot diagnose a problem fully if we tell only half the story of the problem. So this past April, for example, I remember reading about the European Commission president, whose name I will not pronounce because I think I will not do it justice, but it's Ursula, can I get help? Von der Leyen, thank you. And the meeting that she had with the Turkish president and the European Union Council president. And at that meeting, both men were giving chairs and she wasn't giving a chair. And so she stood there awkwardly for a bit, and then she sat on the sofa. And before she did that, the way that she showed her discontent was simply to make a small sound, ahem. And later she wrote, I am the president of the European Commission, and this is how I expected to be treated on my visit to Turkey as the president of the European Commission. So now a German woman was telling me how she and her friends were very disappointed that, that Madame Ursula von der Leyen did not speak up at that moment, and that she only made that sound, ahem. But I was pleased when this German woman also added that she was not sure what she would have done in the same situation, whether she would have had the courage to ask for a chair. And so when we think about issues of this sort, it is not only about female socialization, but also about the expectations that the world has on women. We must recognize that it is a difficult thing to raise a woman in a world that tells her not to show anger, that penalizes her for showing anger, and then suddenly, overnight, demands that she show her anger. The burden of fixing what is broken should not only be on women. Men must share this burden. It is a journey to justice, and it must be shared. I know, for example, that I probably would have demanded a chair. But I also know that many women, not all women, we're all raised differently. We all have our different strengths and our weaknesses. But the larger point is that we live in a world that makes it difficult for women to show negative emotion publicly, because it's very easy to be labeled a bitch. So I want to briefly talk about the role of men. She was at a meeting with a man who was the European Union Council president, and he sat on the chair. She didn't have a chair. He shouldn't have sat on the chair. He should have said she needs a chair. And here's why. Because the world is male-dominated and male-appeasing. And so men have to be part of remaking this world. In meetings, when a woman is talking and a man interrupts, another man should step up and say, shut up. Because we live in a world in which men listen to men. Because men have such power, for example, in hiring women to positions on boards, we will never reach true equality if men are not part of the justice movement for equality. And here's an example that's very common in Nigeria. You walk into a restaurant with a man, and the waiter comes up, and the waiter greets the man and ignores you. And then often, when you then make a fuss, people turn to you and say, why are you making a fuss? And often the man who's asking you why you're making a fuss himself has enjoyed being greeted and acknowledged. And so it becomes the woman who has to explain why she wants to be acknowledged in the way that human beings want to be acknowledged. And so when I say that women are not allowed to get angry, of course women get angry every day. So what do I mean? I mean that women know that there are potential consequences for being angry publicly, and that the knowledge of these potential consequences silences them. If you know you're going to be called a bitch if you express your anger, you quickly learn to censor yourself because you realize that to be labeled has very grave consequences, and one of those consequences is making it almost impossible for you even to be heard. So often we ask women, how is anger useful? And with women, we speak endlessly of backlash. But we respect male anger, even when it is unfounded. And you can look at the literature of what they call incels in the US to understand what it is about excusing male anger that is utterly unfounded. And so today it has become fashionable to tell women to push back. And I agree with this wholeheartedly. We should teach women and encourage women to push back. But we must also, while we do that, we must also understand that we should put as much of an effort into remaking the world so that when women do push back, they're not judged differently. I have American women friends who tell me that men in their workplace get promotions by acting a certain way. But when they do, when women act the same way, they get performance managed. And they're told that they're too pushy, too confrontational, too presumptuous. And so often for the same behavior, a man is called confident, a woman is called arrogant. A man is called uncompromising, a woman is called a ball breaker. A man is called assertive, a woman is called aggressive. A man is strategic, a woman is manipulative. A man is a leader, a woman is controlling. A man is authoritative, a woman is annoying. And so female socialization matters, and we must talk about it. And female socialization, what I've found is that while there are differences all over the world, there are really major similarities that cut across culture, race, class. One of which is likability, that all over the world, girls are raised to think of likability as something essential for them, that they should be liked. And I think that all human beings like to be liked. I think it's lovely to be liked. But for girls and women, they're often taught this insidious need to be liked. And that often then becomes dangerous for them when they're dealing with situations that are harmful to them. There's so many girls who cannot speak out about being victims of sexual assault because they want to be nice, because they want to be liked. I find also that cutting across culture and race and class is that girls and women and girls are raised to pretend to be less intelligent than they are, to reduce themselves. And often the reason for this is the management of the male ego. Also, I've observed that they often are taught to apologize for occupying their God-given space in the world. And most of all, they know that doing these things, often the world rewards them, and not doing them, the world censures them. These things matter, and these things must change. I remember once doing an event in Lagos, and when it was time for Q&A, a very eager young man stood up at the back and said, "I used to like you when you were just a writer, but when you started talking about feminism and gay people, I no longer liked you." And what I thought was, has it occurred to you whether I like you and whether I want you to like me? It is important for me to be a subject and not an object in the sentence of my life. Too often, women and girls are made to feel themselves only as objects in the sentences of their lives. I think it is all well and good to tell girls that somebody doesn't like them or that somebody likes them, but I think it's just as important to tell them that they also have the power to like and dislike. I personally very jealously guard my own ability and my own power to like and dislike. And this is what I believe we should teach more girls today. And this also reminds me of a story that I just read about Angela Merkel, a woman I admire very much, who I was very excited to meet 2 days ago. And So apparently, one of the early meetings that Angela Merkel had with Vladimir Putin, he had done his research on her and discovered that she did not like dogs because she'd been bitten by a dog when she was a little girl, and so she was afraid of dogs. And so when she arrives for the meeting and she gets seated, the first thing he does promptly is open the door and let the dogs out. And Chancellor Merkel sits there pretending that she's not terrified of the dogs. And I read this and I remember just feeling this rage on her behalf. And also thinking, why didn't she just say, get these dogs out of the room? And a man with whom I had this conversation said, well, she wanted to show him that she was not afraid. And I understand that, but I think what made me sad about that story is that she wanted to show him that she was not afraid, but she was doing that on his own terms. And it made me think about how, very often, women do not even get to show their strength on their own terms. So March 8th, which is International Women's Day, is a day on which I get many invitations to come speak about the glories of women in different parts of the world, and I nearly always say no, because I have very mixed feelings about that day. Even just the idea of an International Women's Day. I want us to get to a point in the world where we don't need it. But anyway, it's a day on which often there are quotes from people in power, overwhelmingly men, quotes about women. And I'm struck by how these quotes are invariably about how wonderful women are, how women are peacemakers, how women are virtuous. The premise of most of these quotes is often that women are morally better than men. And I do not subscribe to this view at all. Women are not special. Women are just human. The danger of this thinking, that women are special, is that if women are seen as somehow special, or somehow morally better than men, then it justifies their being held to a higher and more unfair standard. And it also keeps the standard too low for men. Some years ago, there was a Nigerian politician called Patricia Ete, and she had done what most Nigerian politicians do, which is steal public money. And the news was made public, and there was stories about how much she had stolen, and I was so struck by the vitriol that followed this, the publication of her thefts. But most of all, what struck me was how often people would say, but how could she steal so much? She's a woman. Studies show us that voters expect virtuous behavior from female candidates, and even more interesting is that female voters in particular expect virtuous behavior more from female candidates than from men. For them, women must meet higher and far more moralistic standards of behavior than any man. It's the problem of Caesar's wife. She must always be seen as above even the shadow of suspicion. And so this inherently virtuous view of women is very dangerous for women, especially in the criminal justice system, because it often affects how rape trials are conducted. When rape trials become not about the evil of rape, but about how good or virtuous the woman was. I think this view of women also complicated the Me Too movement and the way that the Me Too movement was covered. The undertone to much of the coverage, especially in the US, which is an area I know well, was that we need women to be good before we consider them worthy of justice or sympathy. So examples are stories in which we're told that, many stories in ways women's agency are removed from them. So she went up to his hotel room to get a glass of water, and then he locks the door and assaults her. And for me, I would often be troubled by this because I would think, well, why can't it be? She went up to his hotel room thinking, something might happen, maybe, maybe not, I'll see, he's kind of cute. And she gets up there and she thinks, actually, he's not that cute. And then he locks the door and assaults her. The difference in the two stories is that in the first one, we've stripped her of all agency. We've created a kind of sort of innocent sprite. And that's the only way it seems to me that we think we can have sympathy for her. So my point is, Women should be allowed to be human. They should be allowed to be difficult and imperfect and complicated and still be deserving of justice and sympathy. The Me Too movement inspired me very much because it was a storytelling movement. It seems to me that never before in the West had women's stories been told and heard in the way that happened during the Me Too movement. And I was also struck by how often men were surprised by the stories. And I have to say how some men were changed by them. I have friends, good men who, believe in equality, at least ostensibly, who were just shocked by the stories and who often said, "Really? That actually happens?" And I remember one man saying to me, "But not that often, right?" And I said, "Actually, very often. I don't know any woman who I know personally and know well enough to have these conversations with who doesn't have one story, at least one story, of sexual assault or potential sexual assault by a man." I think the Me Too movement also, for me, highlighted how we must change how we think about and talk about women's sexuality. There's too much shame attached to women as the idea of women as sexual beings. And we also need to talk about how women silence themselves because of the stigma of shame. How people silence women because of the stigma of shame. How even the conversation about consent is tainted by the stigma of shame. In many Western cultures, the US, Western Europe, women are expected to be sexy, but not really sexual. Otherwise, what is the point of that word, slut? What is the male equivalent of slut? There isn't one. And so that word slut is not really a criticism of being promiscuous. It is a criticism of women being sexual beings. Because if it were about being promiscuous, then we would have the equivalent for men. And so it is important to see how global this impulse to control women's bodies is. It might be more dramatic in places like Afghanistan, where women who do not want to cover themselves are forced to do so. And I make a distinction here between women who do not want to cover themselves and women who do, because there are, in fact, all over the world, intelligent, independent women who choose to be observant Muslims, and I respect that. But the impulse to control women's bodies is a global impulse. There are places where young girls are still brutally, horribly, evilly cut in the name of female circumcision. But it's the same impulse that leads towards like slut. And by the way, speaking of sort of global, the global oppression of women, it's also interesting to me how I think that sexism is something that is global, of course, but the manifestations are different. And I was thinking recently about how age is so interesting in the way that it intersects with sexism. So in the US, I think women in general become more invisible as they get older because American culture worships youth. And so there is a kind of shallow power that comes to women when they're younger. And as they get older, they become more invisible. In Nigeria, which is a culture that really doesn't worship youth that much, and in fact reveres age and respects age, women are more likely to gain a bit more respect the older they get. Neither is ideal. I once spoke about my relationship to a word that is used very often in liberal circles, and that word is privilege. I spoke about being Black and being a woman, two groups that are not really privileged in the world. But I also spoke about having class privilege, which is a consequence of having been born into a relatively privileged academic family in Nigeria and having a good education. I spoke about how I often have class guilt, how I'm acutely aware of the things I enjoy that I have not really earned, things that come to me because of the accident of my birth. And I spoke finally about how I still enjoy these perks and privileges, even if guiltily. A friend of mine who was an academic, an American academic, was horrified. A dear, lovely woman, but she said, "How can you say that you enjoy your privilege?" And I said, "Because I do." And I think it's important to be honest about these things, and it helps in the difficult and important conversations about not so much dismantling privilege. I prefer to use the expression democratizing privilege. This academic woman's question betrays, I think, a certain longing for a kind of perfection. We know that humans are not perfect by the very virtue of being human, and yet we demand perfection of people. As a storyteller, I do not trade in perfection. I cannot trade in perfection. I do not trust perfection. I do not believe in perfection. If humans were perfect, stories would not exist, because it is our flaws and our imperfections that lend texture to the stories we tell. And so, on this subject of perfection and imperfection, I've been thinking a lot about women and the standards that they're held to. So that all of this talk about teach your sons to respect women, I think that's lovely, but I think we need to make it a bit more nuanced and make it clear that it's respect not as ornaments on a pedestal to be revered, but simply as full and equal human beings. It also makes me think of the mixed messages that we seem to give girls in the world today. So, in theory, when we say to them, stand up for yourself, speak up, push back, but actually, the same people who say that to girls and women will turn around and censure those girls and women when they do speak up and stand up. So it's supposed also to be a thing that we say to girls, you must love yourself. But often girls who really love themselves get some hate. The world is full of men and women who dislike a woman solely because that woman does not dislike herself. So if you're telling a girl to love herself, and if you're telling her girl power and whatnot, you also have to look inward and be honest and make sure that you will not turn around and try to cut her down when she does thrive. We often expect that women must be perfect and flawless before they get sympathy. But even that perfection and flawlessness can backfire and become a reason for them to lose sympathy. And I should say that I'm sometimes ambivalent about the idea of the sisterhood. Because despite my great love for women, the idea of a sisterhood sometimes assumes that we must all agree with each other because we are women. And that would be a terrible and boring world. There are many women with whom I strongly disagree. But I think the point I am trying to make is not so much that sisterhood should be that we always support women because they're women, or we always agree with women because they're women, but that we question where our disagreements are coming from, that we try to make sure that we're disagreeing with her based on her ideas, not because she's a woman. And so in conclusion, storytelling for me is even more important because of the power of symbolism. Symbols really matter. We need more women in positions of power, obviously because women make up half the world, but also because representation matters, because perception matters, and because perception really does shape reality. I think, for example, that the fact of Angela Merkel's existence means that there's so many little girls all over the world, not just in Europe, for whom she represents what is possible. And that matters. So her presence alone creates hope. And there is nothing more essential to the human spirit than hope. Symbols can also give us courage to act. And I actually believe that both are intertwined, courage and hope. I think hope is an act of courage. And I think that courage is born of hope. I really do believe that we can recreate this world. I believe it very, very strongly. I think that by doing, by being, we carve out a small space, we shape it and we reshape it. And so in that way, small slice by small slice. We walk slowly, yes, but we walk on the path of progress. Thank you.